Welcome to Founding Chronicles. We bring you forgotten stories and haunting moments of American history. If you enjoy our journey through the past, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss what comes next. Now let us begin our story. The year was 1944. The world was at war, and young men from every corner of America had left their homes, their families, and the warmth of small towns to serve on seas that stretched farther than they had ever known. The year was 1944. The world was at war, and young men from every corner of America had left their homes, their families, and the warmth of their small towns to serve on seas that stretched far beyond anything they had ever known. One of those young men was William "Billy" Carver. He was only 19 years old, a boy from Norfolk, Virginia, who had grown up near the shipyards. His father had worked with steel and iron, and his mother had kept the family close through long nights and lean meals. Billy was like so many others of his generation. He dreamed of more, dreamed of the adventure that service promised, and believed, deep down, that he had a duty to defend the flag that waved over his childhood home. In early 1944, Billy joined the Navy. He was lanky, with a boyish grin that never quite left his face, even in the hardest of moments. The cameras of the time, with their slow shutters and stiff poses, rarely caught men smiling. But Billy had a way of breaking that rule. He laughed with the crew, told stories late into the night, and reminded them of the lives waiting back home, the sweethearts, the mothers, the little sisters and brothers they all hoped to return to. And then came the day when one of his shipmates, a young man named Henry Dalton, pulled out a camera. Soldiers and sailors carried them sometimes, though film was expensive and rare. Every frame mattered. Each photograph was like a piece of borrowed time, something to take back home, proof that they had lived through those years, proof that they had mattered. That morning, the ocean was calm. The gray waves rocked beneath the ship like the slow breathing of something ancient and alive. The crew gathered on deck. They were restless, waiting for orders, waiting for movement, waiting for the endless uncertainty of war to decide where they would go next. Henry wanted to capture the moment, the laughter, the youth, the men standing proud in their uniforms. Billy stepped forward, raising his hand with that same wide grin. He waved at the camera as though it were a window into his hometown, as though behind the lens stood his mother, his father, his little sister Mary, waiting to see him safe and whole. Henry focused, adjusted the frame, and clicked the shutter. Got it. Seemed so simple. Just another picture. Just another sailor waving at the camera. Another face among the millions captured during those years of fire and steel. But later, when the film was developed, something caught Henry's eye. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a blur from the sea, or the shadows cast by the rising sun. But the more he looked, the more his heart began to pound. Behind Billy, in the far edge of the frame, something stood out at first glance. It looked like another sailor, tall, still, blurred as though the camera had caught him in the moment between steps. But the figure wasn't right. His uniform seemed darker, the shape of the cap slightly wrong, the lines of his face hidden in a shadow that the daylight should have erased. Henry showed it to another man, then another, and soon whispers began to spread across the deck. Who had been standing there? No one remembered anyone in that spot. No one remembered a man behind Billy. They remembered the moment, the laughter, the sun glinting off the water. They remembered Billy's wave. But they did not remember a figure. The men studied the photograph again and again. Some swore they could see a faint outline where the face should be empty sockets, or maybe just the blur of the sea. Others said it looked like a man they had once known, a sailor who had died months before when their ship had been torpedoed. His name was Thomas Avery. Thomas had been a friend to many. He had been lost during a nighttime attack in the North Atlantic, swallowed by the freezing black water before anyone could reach him. His body had never been recovered. But looking at the photograph, some said they could see his jawline, the curve of his shoulders, the way he had once stood on deck when watching the horizon. The photograph was passed around like a sacred relic. Some touched it with trembling fingers. Others refused to look at it twice. War was already haunted with ghosts of those left behind, ghosts of those who would never return. But this photograph was different. It was proof. Proof that something lingered. Proof that the past was not gone. Billy himself tried to laugh it off. "It's just the shadows," he said. "The sea plays tricks on your eyes." But when he looked at the picture late at night, when the ship was quiet and the stars hung heavy above the waves, even he felt a chill run through him. And then strange things began to happen. At first, it was little things. The sound of boots. On the deck, when no one was walking. A voice calling a name in the dark, only for the man to turn and find no one there. Tools misplaced, ropes untied, small disruptions that could be blamed on tired minds and clumsy hands. But soon, the crew could no longer dismiss it as coincidence. Doors slammed without wind. Lanterns flickered in perfect stillness. One man swore he saw a figure in the engine room, standing at the far end of the hall, but when he ran forward, the hall was empty. Another claimed he felt a hand on his shoulder. In the night, cold and heavy, only to wake and find his bunk empty around him. Every time something strange happened, the men thought of the photograph. They thought of the figure standing behind Billy's wave. And whispers began to spread, whispers that this was not just a trick of the film, not just a shadow. This was a warning. The sea held too many dead. Too many young men swallowed whole. Their names written only on letters that never reached home, their bodies sinking into silence. Perhaps, the men said, the sea did not let them go. Perhaps sometimes they came back. Billy tried to stay strong. He tried to keep the men's spirits up the way he always had. But even he could not ignore the feeling that something unseen moved among them. Something that had been caught in that single wave of the hand, that single click of the shutter. It was not long before the photograph was locked away in the captain's quarters. The officers dismissed it as nonsense, superstition. But they could not ignore the unease in the men's eyes, the way they looked over their shoulders, the way they jumped at every sound. The photograph became forbidden, spoken of only in whispers, a secret the crew carried with them. And yet, even locked away, its shadow remained. For war was not only fought with guns and steel. It was fought in the hearts of men, in the quiet spaces between battles, in the moments when the ocean stretched endless, and the ghosts of the lost seemed to whisper in the wind. And for the men aboard that ship in 1944, the photograph was no longer just a picture. It was a haunting. The sea carried them forward into the summer of 1944, and though the war raged across continents and skies and fields, it was the silence between the battles that weighed most heavily on the men, for silence is never empty at sea. It is filled with echoes that cannot be explained. Billy Carver tried to keep up his grin, but the photograph had changed something inside him. The picture of his wave, the picture of that figure behind him, pressed on his mind like a hand that would not lift. He could not shake the feeling that eyes were always on him, watching from just beyond the edge of light nights, grew colder, though the weather remained the same, and the men began to whisper of footsteps on deck that did not match any man aboard of shapes. Seen in the mist rolling across the water, like pale curtains slipping over the ship, one sailor swore that while standing watch he saw a shadow step out of the fog and then vanish before his eyes, leaving him trembling, too afraid to call out. The officers told them to stay calm. They told them to focus on their duties. They told them fear was more dangerous than the enemy. but words could not erase what the men felt, because it was not just fear, it was presence. It was as though someone who should not be there was walking among them. Billy thought often of Thomas Avery, the sailor who had gone down months before in the black Atlantic, the man some believed appeared in the photograph. He had been a friend to many. His laughter still echoed in their memories, and Billy remembered how Thomas had stood on deck on his final night, speaking softly about home and about the stars over Virginia's skies, and Billy wondered if the sea had given him back in some strange way. Then came the night that no one ever forgot. The night the ship rolled in calm water under a moon that glowed pale and thin like the face of a ghost. Billy was on deck with Henry Dalton, the man who had taken the picture. The air was still the sea, smooth and flat. Henry whispered that he felt something behind them, but when Billy turned, there was nothing, only shadows and the silver shine of the sea. Henry lifted his hand as if to take another picture, though his camera hung empty around his neck, and then he froze. Billy looked and saw a figure standing by the rail, tall and silent. The uniform, dark though it bore the shape of the navy cap, the head turned slowly, though no face could be seen. Billy felt his chest tighten, his voice locked in his throat. Henry whispered one word, Thomas. Before they could move, the figure seemed to fade, dissolving into the night air like smoke from a dying fire, leaving the rail empty, yet leaving the chill of something that had stood there. Word of the sighting spread fast, and by dawn the whole crew was caught between silence and fear. Men avoided the lower decks where shadows hung heavy. Men hurried across passageways where they once walked slow. They spoke in whispers and glanced at the doors of the captain's quarters, where the photograph remained locked away. The captain ordered the men to forget. He told them no ghost could stand on his ship, but his words were flat, and even he avoided the quarters at night. Even he refused to open the drawer where the photograph lay. Days that followed carried more signs. Ropes tied by steady hands were found loose within hours. Tools vanished from locked chests, only to appear in strange corners. One man claimed to see wet footprints trailing across the deck, though no one had come from the sea. The prints vanished as the sun rose. Billy grew restless. Sleep would not come, and when it did, he dreamed of faces under the water, pale and drifting eyes, wide and open mouths moving with no sound. He dreamed of Thomas Avery reaching for him, his hand breaking through the surface of black waves, only to drag Billy down into darkness. Dreams followed him into waking. He would glance at the horizon and swear he saw heads just above the water, watching him, then sinking beneath the waves. He began to feel that his wave to the camera had not been innocent at all, but a signal, as if by lifting his hand he had invited something to return, something that should have remained in the depths. The crew carried on their duties. They still laughed, sometimes still shared stories of home, but their voices were lower, their eyes were darker, and even in moments of cheer there was a weight on them like a storm cloud that would not pass. As summer bled into autumn, the war drew them farther into dangerous waters. But even in the roar of battle, even in the scream of shells and the thunder of guns, the men spoke of the photograph and of the shadow behind Billy's wave. They said it was not the enemy they feared most, but the sea itself and the dead it refused to keep. And so the story of that one picture became more than a story. It became a haunting. It became a truth that no officer could stamp out and no sailor could deny, because they all felt it, they all saw it, they all knew that something had stepped back onto their ship the moment Billy raised his hand and smiled for the camera. Winter winds struck the ocean hard in late 1944, and the ship carried its men through waters colder and darker than they had ever known. The sea was not gentle. Now it crashed against the steel and howled through the rigging like a voice mourning. For the lost, the sailors grew weary, and the shadows that followed them grew heavier. Billy Carver no longer tried to laugh off the photograph, for he felt its weight each time he closed his eyes. The image of his own smiling face with that figure behind him had become a mark upon his soul. He no longer slept easily, and when he did, his dreams dragged him back to that rail, to that silent watcher with no face. Henry Dalton, the one who had taken the picture, seemed to suffer worse. He grew pale. His hands shook. He carried the empty camera like a cross, and he whispered at times to the dark, as if bargaining with it. Men began to keep away from him for fear that whatever clung to the picture clung to him as well. One night, while the storm raged, the lanterns flickered low, and the ship moaned against the waves. A cry tore through the decks. A man had vanished from his post. No one had seen him go. No one had heard a splash, yet his boots stood neatly at the edge of the deck as if he had stepped out of them and walked barefoot into the sea. His name was Joseph Miller, and he had been strong and steady, never one to falter. And yet he was gone without trace. Men whispered that the ghost had taken him, that Thomas Avery or whatever shadow wore his shape had come for him. The captain tried to calm them, but even his voice cracked, and his eyes shifted too often toward the locked drawer in his quarters where the cursed photograph lay hidden. After Joseph disappeared, the crew changed. Forever laughter died from the ship. Conversations turned to murmurs. Even in daylight, the men glanced over their shoulders. Billy felt a weight on his chest, as if every breath was borrowed. Henry stopped eating for days at a time, muttering that the shadow was not finished, that the wave in the picture had been an invitation, and now it demanded more. Another week passed before the next sign came. Late at night, the sound of boots rang down the hall, heavy, measured, and slow. Billy rose from his bunk and followed the noise, his heart pounding each step louder than the last. But the hall was empty. The lanterns burned low, and yet the boots echoed as if someone walked just ahead of him. He called out, but no answer came. The sound moved toward the captain's quarters, then stopped at the door where the photograph slept. Billy froze. He felt the air drop cold. He swore he saw the knob turn, though no hand touched it, and then silence pressed in heavier than the sea itself when he opened the door. The drawer was wide, as if something unseen had already looked at the picture. Captain found him standing there, pale and shaking. The old man locked the drawer again, but his hands trembled, and he did not scold Billy. Instead, he whispered a prayer under his breath, one Billy remembered hearing only once before at a funeral. Days blurred together, storms and silent screams and whispers. The sea rolled black and endless, and the photograph, though hidden, remained a presence among them. The figure behind Billy's wave was no longer just an image. It was a companion, an intruder, a ghost among the living. Henry grew worse. He said he could hear Thomas calling him, calling all of them. He swore he had seen him again on the deck in the fog, standing near the rail, his hand raised not in farewell, but in summons. Henry begged the men not to look at the sea, not to answer its call. He warned that once you met the eyes of the drowned, you would not return. The crew tried to avoid him, but deep down they felt it too. The ocean no longer looked empty. It looked crowded with the unseen faces of the fallen. Each wave a grave, each gust of wind a voice. Then came another loss. A second man vanished from his watch, this time leaving no trace at all, only his cap drifting against the rail, as if set there gently by unseen fingers. His name was Andrew Price, and he had been cheerful, once always singing in the dark. But his song was gone, and the silence that replaced it was heavier than any storm. The men were breaking. The war outside seemed less cruel than the war within. For how do you fight what you cannot see? How do you battle what rises from a photograph, from memory, from the depths of the sea? Billy felt his own mind faltering. He clutched his dog tags in the night, whispering the names of his family as if to hold himself anchored. He began to think of his wave, that careless smile, that gesture meant for his mother, for his sister, for his hometown. He began to think it had opened a door. He began to fear that by waving he had welcomed the lost back aboard, and now they wanted company, and as winter deepened, the sea did not let them forget. The final months of 1944 pressed hard against the ship. the crew thinner now their faces, hollow their eyes sunken, the laughter of young men long gone, replaced by silence, and the constant moan of the sea. The photograph still locked away, still hidden. And yet its shadow covered them like a shroud. Billy Carver could not escape it. He saw the figure behind his wave in every reflection, in the glass of the portholes, in the ripples of dark water, even in the shine of another man's eyes. He knew it was not just Thomas Avery anymore. It was something greater, something that gathered the dead of the sea and walked among the living. Henry Dalton broke first one night. He tore from his bunk and ran across the deck shouting that Thomas was there calling. For him, the men chased after him, their boots striking against steel, but Henry reached the rail before they could stop him, his voice rising in a cry. It split the night, and then he was gone, swallowed by black water, his cap spinning once on the waves before vanishing into nothing. The crew searched, but they knew there was no saving him. The sea had taken what it demanded, another soul to follow the shadow behind the smile, another name to be carried among the drowned. Billy stood silent at the rail long after the others had left. He gripped the cold steel until his hands bled, and he whispered to the waves, "If you want me, take me, but let the others be." He waited for an answer, but the sea gave none, only the endless slap of water and the whisper of wind. The captain called the men together. The next day, his face gray, his hands shaking, he admitted that he had looked at the photograph again. He confessed that when he stared at it in the lamplight, he saw not one figure but many. Behind Billy, behind Thomas, behind the blur, shadows stacked upon shadows, reaching forward as if through time itself. He said he believed the picture had trapped something, a moment where the living and the dead crossed a doorway that never closed. He ordered the photograph burned, but when they set the flame to it, the paper blackened, curled, and then refused to vanish. The image of him, Billy waving with the shadow behind him, clung stubbornly. Even as the edges turned to ash, the captain threw it into the sea, and the men watched it drift across the waves, glowing faint in the moonlight before sinking slow into darkness. For a brief moment, the ship grew quiet, the air felt lighter. The men almost dared to breathe again. But that night, the footsteps returned heavier than ever, pacing the decks while the crew huddled in silence, the sound of boots striking steel echoing like a heartbeat of the dead. Billy knew then that it would never end. The wave had marked him, the picture had chained them, and the sea had claimed its due. When the war finally closed in 1945, and the ship limped home with fewer men than it had carried out, the survivors spoke little of what had happened. They spoke of battles and storms, of friends lost to torpedoes and fire, but of the photograph they did not speak, for some things were not meant for ears on shore. Billy carried the memory all his life. He returned home to Virginia. He built a quiet life. He raised children and told them stories of courage, of duty, of friendship, but never once did he tell them of the day he waved at the camera. Never once did he tell them of the shadow behind him. Yet the photograph was not forgotten. For years later, when the ship was decommissioned and its relics stored in dusty boxes, a faded picture was found among them, a sailor smiling and waving, and behind him the faint figure of another man standing still at the rail, his face lost in shadow. Historians studied it, skeptics dismissed it, believers whispered of it. But those who had been there, those few who remained, looked once and then turned away, for they knew what it meant. They knew what it had cost, and they knew the sea never forgets. And so the story lives on the tale of a sailor waving at the camera. In 1944, a simple gesture caught on film that became a haunting, that followed men through storm and silence through war, and into memory, a reminder that the sea holds its dead close, and sometimes it lets them be seen.